Hello. In this lecture, I will be confronting what is sometimes called the problem of knowledge, or the problem of veridical perception. In some ways, it's taking the bull by the horns, because it's really an attempt to answer the question, how do we come to know something? How do we achieve confidence and trust in our perceptions, that what we see before our eyes is true and is real? I hope that in this video I can convincingly argue, and if not, demonstrate that thinking itself is in some way the solution. It creates the problem by thinking about it. Through thinking, it's only through thinking that we can wonder about something. We can ask questions. It creates the problem, but it also delivers us the solution. Ordinarily, we have the idea of thinking. Our concept of thinking is that it's something kind of, thinking is just inside of my own head. So it's sort of like thinking is in here, and then there's a world out there. And they have a more or less, they can sort of match up, but they're fundamentally separate things. I think that's the sort of initial and somewhat naive view that we have of the matter. Again, I hope that through this lecture I can make a convincing case, and even I hope that it will be self-evident, in fact, by the end of this lecture, that thinking is not merely an afterthought in respect to the world, in respect to reality. Thinking is not just an afterthought in respect to reality, but it's in some ways kind of like the pith and marrow of reality itself. I know that can seem kind of like like a surprising, ambitious, and maybe even absurd statement. But I hope that by the end of this lecture that it will, I hope at the very least it will seem reasonable. And again, though, I do hope that it almost becomes self-evident. Again, this is somehow, it's sort of taking the bull by the horns, because this is it's a very fundamental question, obviously. But it's a necessary question. Unless we have to in some way have a confidence that we can know things, that we can learn things, we can perceive things that are real. If we don't have that confidence, it's hard to marshal the motivation to try to learn anything, to engage in any kind of philosophy or science, if we don't think that what we're engaging with in the first place, if we think it has no hope of delivering us to the truth of things. And so it's maybe an ambitious question, but it's also in some ways a necessary, a significant question, and even necessary one. In order to, in some ways, approach this problem or provide an entry point into this problem, I will be drawing on another parable, as probably will be no surprise by this point. This parable it actually comes from the Buddhist canon. It's a Buddhist sutra, and in fact, so sutra means thread, and in the same way that, so all of the Buddhist canon, it's kind of a handy image. You think of the Buddhist, every story in the Buddhist canon is like it's almost like a bead on a necklace, and the sutra is the thread that draws them all together, the sutras, and so this is sort of one story or one parable among very many that together they present the comprehensive picture of Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist teaching. This one is written in roughly 150 BC, so over 2,000 years ago, and it's called the Nāgasenabhiksu-sūtra. It records basically a dialogue or an exchange between a king and a Buddhist sage. The king is named King Milinda, and the Buddhist sage is called Nagasena. And so it begins, the king has, in some ways, solicited Buddhist wisdom from this sage. And so the sage obliges him and says, so how did you come here, Your Highness? Did you come on foot, or did you come on horseback? And the king responds, I came on a chariot. And this is not a surprising response for a king in those days, that he didn't come on foot or on a horseback, but rather he was born in a chariot. Nagasena says, you say, good king, that you came on a chariot. Very well. This being so, it will surely present no trouble for your lordship to explain what a chariot is. So we're inquiring, into the essence of the chariot. He could point to the chariot, but this is a question of trying to understand what makes that chariot a chariot. So Nagasena starts him off and says, is the pole the chariot? And the king says, no, wise sir. Is then the wheel the chariot? Nagasena says. The king responds, no again, good sir. Is any of the wheels or all of the wheels the chariot? Nagasena asks, and of course the king again answers no. Is the frame or the yoke the chariot? Again, the king has to respond that in truth none of them is the chariot. And finally Nagasena just asks, is any of its parts the chariot? Of course the king has to respond, indeed, no, none of the parts is the chariot. Nagasena asks then, is the combination of parts the chariot? If we laid out the wheel, the frame, the yoke, and all of the parts, if we laid them out or assembled them into a heap, would that be a chariot? Of course, the king again has to answer that no. In fact, the aggregation of parts by itself is not a chariot. Nagasena asks then, if the chariot is not inside of these parts, then is the chariot outside of these parts? So suppose that we had a heap of all of the components of a chariot. We've concluded that the chariot is not inside of the heap. And so then we might say, well, maybe that it's outside of the heap, but that's obviously absurd. We wouldn't turn away from the heap to look somewhere else to find the chariot. If the chariot is not inside of these parts or outside of these parts, what is the chariot? And finally, the king is forced to concede in some way, like kind of wave the white flag and say that now I'm perplexed. Nagasena has thoroughly confounded the king. And this is the end of the sutra continues, but this is the end of the parable that I'll be using here. And as we can see, it's we can pose a similar question to the one that we posed at the very outset of this series of lectures, after the presentation of the blind man and the elephant, that parable. The blind man and the elephant. Once we presented that parable, then we posed the question: what exactly went wrong for those blind men? Like, what condition were they missing in order to have correctly perceived the elephant that was before them, rather than merely perceiving aspects or features of the elephant? What was between them and perceiving the elephant as a whole? We can pose a similar question here and say what's missing for the king? Why is this apparently self-evident fact of a chariot? Why is it eluding him? And clearly, the answer has something to do with a relation between the whole and the parts. And so, in some way, the king is attempting to arrive at the chariot by way of analysis. In other words, looking for the whole as one of the parts, among the parts, looking for the whole among the parts. And clearly, it's the minute we begin to reflect, the relationship is somewhat what's more interesting than it might first appear, because again, as the king has demonstrated, as the parable demonstrates, the whole is not. You can't find the whole in the same way that you find the parts. In some way, though, the whole is kind of it's present in every part. It's sort of like enlivening or shining through all of the parts. The parts, when they're assembled in the right way, it's as though the whole suddenly appears. It's as though it's reflected. And in fact, the whole is also, if you imagine the creation of the chariot, like whoever assembled the chariot, the whole was in some ways already present in this person's mind, and almost the whole is almost the idea of the chariot, and that's of course what we're looking for here. And the idea of the chariot is not exactly present in any single one of its parts, but at the same time, the idea of the chariot is what guided and it's what ordered whoever was assembling all of those parts. It's what guided and ordered that person's process, so that person could sort of know what the next thing to do was, because he or she would have had the image or the idea of the whole in his or her mind, as she was going through that process. And so it sort of, I hope that I've kind of suggested the answer to this problem, which is that the whole is in some way the whole is the idea, or the whole is the concept. And so the essence of the chariot, it's not exactly the kind of thing we might have thought at first. The essence of the chariot is the concept of the chariot, or the idea of the chariot. That's what differentiates, just again a heap of components from an actual chariot. It's that the actual chariot sort of embodies or instantiates the concept of a chariot. And so we have two things, a sort of confluence of two things, a concept on one side and matter or parts or components on the other side. And it's in order for the thing to come into being, those two, the concept on the one side and the matter on the other side, have to, a relationship has to, it's necessary to establish a certain relationship between those two aspects, or those two elements. And if you only have the idea of the chariot on one side, that's not the same thing as the chariot as the object of a chariot. The idea by itself is not the same thing as an object. But it's a necessary condition. And I think that's a somewhat surprising conclusion to arrive at. By the same token, the parts themselves, or the matter itself, you could even think of the kind of elemental matter, like iron and bronze and wood, all of the elemental matter that constitutes the chariot materially. That also by itself, it's a necessary condition for the object of a chariot, but it's not a sufficient condition. And again, the necessary and sufficient conditions are that those two things in some way, the concept on the one side and the matter on the other side, they sort of join together. There's a marriage. There's a conjunction of those two things in the proper way. We can ask now sort of inquire deeper into this model that we've set up, and in a very similar way to the blind man and the elephant, this model, it can help us. The parable, it becomes an analogy or a model or an image of our own processes of cognition. And so this is again a way that we're attempting to become critical about thinking itself, reflecting on thinking, or thinking about thinking. We already began this project at the very outset of these lectures, and we're merely attempting to deepen it. And in a similar, just as each one of these lectures in some ways, it's very analogous to one of the blind men approaching the elephant from that particular aspect. Each one of these lectures is an attempt to, again, sort of get at our ultimate elephant, which is, critical thinking itself. And so this parable and this lecture is again another approach to our so-called elephant. We can, though, really try to deepen this particular aspect that we have today, and sort of pose some thought experiments and say something like, or consider something like, well, so again, the chariot itself is not in any one of its parts, but what kind of flexibility do we have here? So suppose that you have a chariot with wheels, and suppose somebody says, well, here's a chariot, but it doesn't have wheels. It has instead of wheels, it has runners. And then we'll be confronted with this object, and it's not so straightforward anymore, though, because by changing one small part, suddenly you would not call that a chariot at all anymore. It's not a chariot any longer. Again, the chariot is a sort of it's a conjunction or a marriage of the idea of the chariot with the appropriate components to make up the chariot, to compose the chariot, and it's a sort of a functional wedding of those two things. It's, in other words, the sort of the measure of whether that the marriage has been properly achieved or properly consummated is whether the chariot works. Like it's a functional question. And a chariot works obviously by being pulled by horses, by rolling over the ground on wheels. if you change the wheels with runners, then it's simply not a chariot anymore. Instead, it's become a sleigh. And so this can give us a new way of thinking about the world that we the world around us, our environment. We're obviously part of that environment too. It gives us another way of, and not only another way, but a better way, in the sense that it's more accurate, a more accurate way of conceptualizing what kind of thing reality is, what kind of thing the world is. If you can begin to see how the concept of a chariot on the one side and the concept of a sleigh on the other side, they are themselves something, they're mutually exclusive. Like a chariot can't be a sleigh and a sleigh can't be a chariot. If it's one thing, if it's one of those things, it's not the other. And again, the kind of definitive, the question of whether it's a sleigh or a chariot is definitively answered by whether it's functionally designed to slide across ice and snow, or to roll across the dry earth. And clearly you could, so in other words, the wheels and the runners, those are sort of like essential features of that kind of define the chariot against the sleigh. Now we've established this conceptual, and it's not only conceptual because it's also real. In other words, this is not something we just think about in our heads. There's an obvious difference between the chariot and the sleigh. And so we've established that these two things, the concept of the sleigh and the concept of the chariot, are in some ways beholden to the logical law of non-contradiction. Like, it can't be both a sleigh and a chariot. It's one or the other. At the same time, though, and this is really this can offer I think a new and exciting insight, is that at the same time as the sleigh and the chariot are kind of different from one another, so separate from one another, they're also essentially related to one another. And so if we imagine we have the world arrayed in space and time around us, but we can also imagine a world of ideas and concepts. And in a way that the world of space and time and objects and matter, objects, one object is, it can't be, two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time, right? They sort of, they can't be coextensive. In some way, the concepts, if we imagine the concept of a chariot and the concept of a sleigh, they're both mutually exclusive, but they also, in some ways, they're also, it's as though they're not spatial in the first place. So they interpenetrate. And I guess what I'm trying to lead us to this insight is that in this sort of conceptual world, every concept is related and different from every other concept. And so they form a sort of there's a sort of perfect harmony amongst the ideas that we have. And this harmony it's irrespective of whatever we might, whatever chaos might, or whatever disharmony or chaos might appear to confront us in the so-called objective world. And again, what I mean by that is, for example, suppose that I can't see the bottom of the it's either there's a vehicle and I can't see the bottom of it, and it's either and I can suppose that it's either a sleigh or a chariot. But as far as I'm concerned, in terms of this particular object, I don't know, and so it's a sort of chaos for me. It's a question, but it's only a question. There's no answer. There's no knowledge. Still, in spite of that fact, in my mind, in other words, in the world of I see the chariot through my eyes, but I grasp, or I see the chariot and the sleigh. I see the idea of the chariot and the idea of the sleigh with my mind, right? And so what I see through my eyes, and what I see with my mind. What I see with my mind in that case, I'm totally clear about it. Like I know that if it has wheels, then it's a chariot, and if it has runners, then it will be a sleigh. And that's what I mean about that's all I mean. That's all I mean to say by the statement that irrespective of whatever confusion confronts us in the in the outer world, we can still have a sort of when we understand an idea, and we have an idea, we know what it means, and we understand when we understand an idea, we also understand its relation to other ideas. And that's what I mean about the chariot and the sleigh. And so, in some ways, we have an entry point into something we can really depend on, we can be confident in. And that was again sort of part of the question at the outset of this lecture, which is how can we be confident in our knowledge? And the answer is, in some ways, when we have an idea, we know what we mean. When we think something, when we have a thought or a concept, the concept is there's no mystery in the concept to us. The mystery comes when we we have to question whether we've properly applied and ordered those concepts to what we're receiving as from the other side, which is as percepts or as sensations. And that's something that I'll take up presently. Before I do that, then I just want to return to the question of changing the chariot into a sleigh and back. What's happening there? And it's clear that there's an essential difference between a chariot and a sleigh, and again that has to do with what it's designed for, what it functions for. And so by essentially, I just mean something that you couldn't change without changing the thing itself. And so it's clear that the wheels and the runners, those are essential aspects of the chariot. I can contrast those, maybe to make the concept of essential more clear. It could be helpful to contrast the concept of essential to that of something that's circumstantial or accidental. So you have essential aspects or essential features of the chariot or the sleigh on the one hand, which you could not change without changing that thing itself. Then you have accidental features, which are many. It's for example, if you painted the chariot gold, this is clearly it clearly would not become a sleigh, or it clearly would not become anything other than a chariot merely from having been painted gold. Yeah, that's different than if you again change the wheels out with runners, or if you put a roof on it, for example. Then you might not call it a chariot anymore. It might become a carriage, for example. And so again, at the beginning, we might have thought that, okay, there's objects out there, and then there are thoughts or concepts in here. And I hope that by now, by what I've said up until now, that view has suddenly become a little bit more questionable, because we've seen that it's very problematic to think about objects separate from our concepts and our ideas about the objects, and that in some way, what an object is a material instantiation, a material example, a material instance of just those ideas. And so suddenly the ideas are not in our heads anymore. They're not merely in our heads anymore. In fact, we can take this even further and pose the question, and this can be a segue into sort of the next topic, or the next problem we have to confront, which is the question of perception through our senses. This can maybe serve as a segue or an entry point into that aspect of the question, because we might say, we might consider that it's only in virtue of having the proper idea itself that allows us, that provides the condition for us to perceive the chariot, for instance. If I don't know what a chariot is beforehand, whatever I see, I will not recognize as a chariot. I'll have to call it a cart with wheels or something. It's probably more illustrative to return to our favorite parable, the blind man and the elephant, and just now we have a little bit we've elaborated some more precise and more sophisticated concepts. And so we can return to that parable. And in a way, every new thing that we learn, it also kind of reorganizes and reflects and maybe even refines everything that we knew before. I've heard the topic, or that notion of kind of the way that every new knowledge, it also affects all prior knowledge. I've heard it called reflux, in the way that something new reflects upon everything that came before it. Whatever we call it, I think we can understand what it means. And by example, when we reflect on the parable of the blind man and the elephant, having now kind of elaborated and articulated these concepts with more relief and more clarity, I think it will be clear that what the blind men were missing, like the necessary condition that they were missing in order to have a true perception of the elephant, rather than just merely perceiving aspects of the elephant. It's exactly this concept or this idea is what they were missing. If they had the idea or the concept of an elephant beforehand, they wouldn't have had any trouble in identifying the elephant. Instead, that's just what they were missing, and so they were forced to call it a tree or a rope, right, or a snake, etc. And so we can conclude then that not only is basically the world made of material condensations of ideas, but moreover, it's only those ideas or our access and our perception of those ideas themselves that provide the condition for us to perceive objects in the first place. And again, I hope I was trying to illustrate that through the parable of the blind man and the elephant. And so again, I think by now the notion of that thinking is just something that we sort of do in our own minds, and then the world out there is sort of just presents itself before us with no internal participation on our part. I think that should now sort of appear as something quite a naive view of things, quite a problematic view. And so we can now, I guess, turn to that question of, by now having established that we don't exactly see things with our eyes alone, like our eyes themselves. Again, or any of one of our senses, and that's the parable of the blind man and the elephant. Obviously, it doesn't do any good to appeal to vision in that parable, because the parable is defined as people without vision. But we can say any one of our senses. We don't perceive the world. We don't perceive the world with our senses. We perceive the world through our senses. We perceive the world with our understanding, with our ideas, with our minds, with our intelligence. And so we see through our eyes, but we see with our minds, with our understanding, with our ideas. We can, though, even consider that in a little bit, a little bit closer, and say, suppose there is a chariot before us, and we might think, well, okay, so the minute we start to think about it, then suddenly it becomes more interesting, because there's the chariot before us, but we might have to ask a question like, well, how do we see the chariot? And then again, the first answer would be we see the chariot with our eyes. But I've shown one way in which that's problematic, and namely that if we didn't know what a chariot was, we wouldn't know what it was we were seeing with our eyes. That's one way that it's problematic, and that's kind of on the conceptual side. In the second part of the lecture, I'm going to try to also sort of inquire into this problem of knowledge through, up until now, we've been mostly trying to approach this problem from the conceptual side. In the second part, I'm going to try to approach it from the perceptual side. And then finally sort of show how those two there can be a sort of, they arrive at the same place, and in fact there's a sort of confluence or a wedding of those two aspects. And then we can sort of feel as though we have our feet firmly placed in perception that we can trust, so truth and perception and knowledge. We might have to ask the question, so again, the chariot is before us, and we say we see it with our eyes. But then we have to ask the question, well, how does the chariot get from out there into our awareness, right? How does it get into our eyes in the first place? And then again, we would say something like, well, the light somehow, of course, we can't see in the dark, and so light appears to be a necessary condition for vision. And so we would say, well, the light somehow, it's as though the light ferries in the image, like it carries, the light carries the image of a chariot into our brains, into our eyes, so it goes into the pupil and then through the lens. And again, this seems like a satisfactory answer until we inquire deeper, but it's immediately fraught with problems because the light from the chariot, this can be demonstrated anatomically. The lens in our eye, in the pupil, it actually it turns the image upside down. So you have an inverted image of the chariot that falls on your retina in the back of your eye. And it's worse than that because, in fact, the retina in the back of the eye, and all mammals have this problem. Interestingly, cephalopods, so like squids and octopi, they don't have this problem that I'm about to explain, which just it's kind of a mystery. With all mammals and reptiles too, the light doesn't, even the inverted image, so it's turned upside down and backwards when it passes through the lens in the eye, the image then falls on the retina in the back. But our retina, they actually open. They don't open out towards the light. They don't open out to where that inverted image falls even. So when we say it's falling on our retina, it's actually falling, the image, it's actually falling on the back of our retina. And the retina actually, they're sort of, it's like the retina, the back of them, the nerve fibers themselves run in front of the endings of those nerves. The endings of those nerves are actually facing backwards, so away from the source of light, which would be the pupils and the apertures in our eyes, in our irises. They're actually facing away from that. They're kind of the heads of the retina, the endings of those nerves. It's like the head is planted in the sand of, that's an image of an ostrich planted in the sand, but it's not sand, but the heads of the retina are planted into what's called the choroid process. And so the retina those are nerves. The choroid process it's vascular tissue. So it's like it's circulation of blood. That tissue is just behind the retina, but the retina itself is actually pointed away from the source of light and not towards it. So whatever image comes from the outside through the lens, not only is it turned upside down and inverted, but it's also it also has to pass through a screen of those basically the fibers of the retina before it actually reaches the heads of the retina, which are the sensitive parts. And it's worse than that because you might say, well, but it makes it there eventually. But it's still, the more we think about it, the more mysterious it becomes because whatever happens to that light once it receives once the retina finally, after a long series of inversions and obstacles, if we imagine the kind of the ends of the retina finally receiving that image, they immediately turn into something that's not light anymore. They turn it into nervous electrical impulses, and so it's worse than that because not only do they then turn it into something that's not light anymore, but they also in order to arrive at the visual cortices in our brains, somewhere in the back of our brains, again they undergo all kinds of inversions and crossings. There's the optic nerve. It crosses itself, and so left becomes right and right becomes left at a place called the optic chiasmus, somewhere behind your forehead. And by this point, again, it's not an image that's crossing it. It's not light that's crossing itself. It's electrical impulses. And then so it finally, after all kinds of series of turns and twists and inversions, and it finally arrives, this electrical impulse now, it finally arrives in the visual cortices of the brain, which those are the areas most likely responsible for processing visual stimuli. By the time it gets back here, it's something so far from whatever entered our eyes in the first place that it just physiologically it's exceedingly improbable that whatever the thing was when it started, that it's the same thing where it finishes. And then again, it's not at all clear how the light comes into our eyes and is immediately converted into something that's not light. How do we have the perception of light? It's as though the visual cortices, they have to sort of reconvert something or transcribe an electrical impulse and turn it again into an image. We have a similar problem. It's like, why is it not dark? Why is it not dark in our dreams? All of these kind of physiological conundra, they might lead us to and then again you say, well, I have somewhat analogous perceptions in my dreams. Like it looks pretty similar to how it looks when I'm looking out of my eyes. We might, on the having kind of problematized the notion of a straightforward visual perception, we might sort of throw up our hands and say, well, who knows? And maybe everything is just a dream. Like maybe I have no connection to what is outside of me, and maybe I'm just dreaming all of my experience. We know that works for part of the day, or we know we have, more or less believable experiences for part of our lives, like while we're sleeping, while we're dreaming. Maybe it's just the same thing while we're awake. The problem is, if the minute that we sort of capitulate in that way and say, well, there's no way to know, we sort of we remove it's kind of a house built on sand, so to speak, or it's as though we're sawing off the branch that we're sitting on, because how could we if our perception and our thinking, it's not something we can trust in the first place. Why should we trust our verdict that it's all just a dream? Like, that's just as baseless as assuming that it's all just reality. And so these are different. They're kind of cul-de-sacs that these lines of thinking can lead us into. And by cul-de-sac, I just mean it's like we're trying to arrive at something that makes sense of the world for us, but we arrive at a sort of something like a dead end. Like it's not clear where to proceed once we have the problem of how light becomes not light and then appears as light again, or any kind of sensation. And similarly, we have another problem if we sort of again loosen our hold on perception through the senses and say, well, maybe we're all just kind of dreaming. Again, there's this runs into the problem of on what basis can we even affirm that if we don't trust the truth of our perception in the first place. So let's try to now kind of having arrayed all of these problems before us, I'm going to try to attempt to rein them in and to draw them together into a sort of a coherence. And so this will, having arrived at this place, I will also try to recall again the first part of the lecture, which again was sort of emphasize the conceptual underpinnings of our perception. And what's missing in both of these cases, in the case of the purely kind of physiological explanation for perception, so we might try to explain perception physiologically, but that ran into a kind of insurmountable problem, which is basically all you have coming in through your eyes is light, and then it's converted into electrical impulses. What is the relationship of those electrical impulses to the chariot in the first place? So that's a kind of apparent dead end in a attempted explanation of perception through physiology. An apparent dead end of an explanation of perception through, I don't know what to call it, but sort of subjectivity, pure kind of internal psychological processes, is that what is the relation to objects and reality in the first place? If you untether yourself from those objects in your attempt to explain them, your explanation is not going to, well, it sort of lost the ground under its feet. If you untether yourself from reality, then it's very hard to get back there. Again, in both of these cases, I think we can solve this what seems like an aporia kind of, or just an enigma. I think the solution lies in trying to find a way to reintegrate the reality of thinking, the reality of ideas, the reality of concepts into our explanation of perception. If we, rather than try to picture the chariot coming into our eyes and then into our brains, if we don't think that way at all, but rather think of, instead, just try to conceptualize the process of perception. Well, here's an analogy. When you, all of these problems that I've indicated, they seem irrelevant when we're trying to, we don't have to ask, reading a book, if we just take up a book, you are confronted with, on the page of a book, you're confronted with just glyphs and symbols, but we don't have the same problem of knowledge in respect to the glyphs and the symbols. And it's because we're not, when we understand a book, it's not because we have somehow analyzed the word. You could come up with a similar thought experiment, just like King Milinda and Nagasena. You could say, if you have a letter, right, and if you have the word 13th, you could say, is the 13th in the T? No. Is it in the H? No. Is it in the I? Obviously, it's a similar situation, actually, because what you really have is a concept, 13th. So, right, it's like the after 12th, before 14th. You have a concept that is intelligible to the reader and to the writer, and this concept then is what the letters, or the word, the spelling, gives the author a way to, in some way, signal this concept, or this kind of structure of understanding to the reader. And the reader doesn't have to the reader doesn't see 13th with his eyes. Again, this is a good example. What you see are shapes on the paper, glyphs, symbols on the paper. But what you recognize in those shapes, they, in some way, the word, the recognition of the word, and the understanding of that word, it means specifically that you're able to relate what you're seeing through your eyes, that you're able to, with your mind then, or with your intelligence, with your understanding, the word indicates to you, or points you, or gestures to you, and by you I mean it gestures to your understanding how to configure itself, where to look in that world of concepts. That might have seemed like a strange abstraction at the beginning of this talk, but I think now it will be much clearer once we relate it to reading. It's amazing just to think how black and white letters on the page can be can invoke and invite an experience of all kinds of worlds and imagination, and just such a rich experience that these black and white symbols on a page can invoke. And it's clearly because they are in some ways guiding our understanding down these pathways in a world of concepts. And then we can imagine, a human being. It's as though imagine that you're standing in a doorway and you have one foot outside and one foot inside. It's as though, part of us looks out into the world of perception, and part of us looks up or in, or the other way, into the world of conception. And to understand something or to perceive something means to, in some way, join those two worlds together, that by the nature of where we are standing, so to speak, and I'm using where not exactly in a spatial sense, not in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical sense. Again, it's like a division between a world that of objects, spatial objects that confront us through our senses, and a world of understandings or concepts or meanings or ideas that we approach not through our senses but through our minds. And to understand something means to rejoin those two worlds. I'm calling them worlds, and I hope that at first it might have been confusing, but I hope that it's by now it's clear how I'm using that word. By analogy, we could imagine, I used one analogy of standing in a doorway on a threshold between two spaces. Another analogy we could think of is to look at a flame. You imagine that, if you imagine looking at a flame, you know that you will, with your eyes, you will perceive the brilliance of the flame, the light of the flame. And then with your sense of touch, you will perceive the warmth of the flame. And but again, this is kind of like a blind man and an elephant scenario, unless you're able to join those two aspects of the flame itself to the idea of the flame. So if you have the idea of the flame, you will recognize the warmth and the light as two different expressions of the flame, or two different aspects, or two different features of the flame. Again, very akin to the parable of the blind man and the elephant. And so similarly, if we have an object before us, that's a kind of unknown object, but we are able, on the one hand, to join the perceptions of the object. And by perception, I mean everything that arrives to us through our senses. If we're able to wed the sensations and the perceptions of the object to the concept of the object, or the idea of the object, this is our kind of the consummation of this wedding will be a veridical perception. One thing that's worth noting, I suppose, is that in a very similar way to how different people have, like some people have greater acuity of vision. I think we can, by analogy, it's clear that people have different understanding, and both on a just sort of scale of value. Like some people have greater understanding. Some people also have just different understanding. And an example is, for instance, a book. Somebody who person could appreciate the book for its meanings, for its contents. And so here's an object before us. You could imagine the book as an object, and again, so I have a certain sensational or sensitive, through my senses, sensible experience of the book, and then I have the concept of a book, and those two things together, I'm able through those two things together, a kind of a convergence of those two things, I recognize the book as a book. But through the same sensible perceptions, I might suppose that I need to heat my house and I have a sort of wood burning stove. I might use the book for firewood or for kindling. In other words, the book could become a combustible object, like fuel. The book can either sort of convey meanings and a narrative and imagination to me, or it can be used as fuel. What I perceive in the book will depend on the understanding, or the one way of saying this perhaps is that my way of looking will determine my way of seeing, or what I can see depends on what I can look for. And so I guess that's maybe a more straightforward way of conveying this point, that people see with different eyes, and they also see with different minds. And even the same person at different times will see with different minds. A person who's very cold, for example, in the winter, will look at everything around them in terms of where to find warmth. Somebody who's thirsty will be looking for water everywhere. So again, these kind of a technical word for it is intentionalities, but these ways of looking will determine what we see, and it'll also determine what we ignore, what we do not see. to really take this in, critically and entirely, it can serve as a kind of an injunction to be continually refining and cultivating, just like a garden. So also weeding and tending, really tending our understanding, and attempting always to develop ourselves in that way, with the understanding that everything every bit of labor and toil that we undertake in respect to our minds, in respect to our understanding, that we will see commensurate and corresponding changes in what we think of as the world. And so we have so in some ways, one way of saying that is that our sight is a function of our insight, and that our insight is something that we can, the development of our insight, we can actually foster and take in hand by, again, cultivating our understanding. So, finally, to kind of attempt to sort of summarize the picture that we've arrived at, rather than trying to discover the truth or the true veridical perception through our sense organs, or merely through our minds, what we see is some way of, we see a sort of a wedding of those two things. And the analogy that I gave is by reading a book. Basically, what we receive through our eyes and through our senses, and this solves the problem of how the light, how the light becomes not light and then light again. In some ways, the way to think about it is by analogy with reading. And what we receive through our eyes is not the object. We receive receive something that is akin to letters that spell out, in the way that letters spell out a word, so sensations, they spell out objects for us. And provided, learning to read means basically learning how to recognize concepts within percepts. So concepts, it's learning to recognize what the sensations are spelling out to our understanding. And then we can easily see how dreaming, the same function that is operative in dreaming, it can account for waking perceptions too, but in a way that doesn't untether those images from reality, from veridicality. And so, kind of to conclude, we can think of sensations. Again, I used an analogy of letters. We can think of them as they become evidence for an object. In the first place, they're mere sensations, like the sensations that we don't recognize what they are, just form and color, a kind of coruscating, blooming, buzzing confusion, to quote a psychologist called William James. It's a blooming, buzzing confusion that confronts us, but we begin to order, with our understanding, with our intelligence, we begin to order the blooming, buzzing confusion. And suddenly, the blooming, buzzing confusion, elements of it, so particular sensations, they become evidence for real objects, but the condition for them to become evidence for those real objects, rather than just mere information or mere sensation, they become evidence once they have been ordered towards a particular concept. And so that's the way that concepts or ideas, they're essential and latent and inherent in everything that we perceive. And in fact, they're the condition for perceiving those things in the first place. In some way, it's as though once we have the concept, then the sensations that are otherwise kind of, they're almost mute. They don't speak for us. When we have the concept, when we arrive at the proper concept, then suddenly they all align themselves, and they begin to sing, they begin to speak. At first they're mute. When we have the proper concept, they speak for us, and they announce that concept as the object. It's in some way, it's like they give the answer to our riddle, almost like a game of like the game of charades, where you have to you can't speak until somebody properly guesses, solves the riddle to the game. Well, in a similar way, the sensations, they're mute to us. They don't have a meaning until we're able to align them or order them or attune them to the right concept. And then suddenly they become, again, they begin to speak. They tell us their truth. So I hope that, just kind of as a final note in this lecture, I hope that some of the statements that I made at the outset, the idea that, thinking is not just in our heads, thinking is something that we somehow, it's a world, it's a world, it's a fact about the world, or an element of the world. It's an element of reality, and we participate in it through our minds and through our understandings. And it's not merely, and so it's not merely an afterthought. Thinking is not. It's rather it's kind of like the kind of the essence of reality itself, the world itself. This, I think, is a conclusion that we can only defensively put it forward, and we can only arrive at it once we've again reflected and brought our faculty of thinking, of critical thinking. Well, we've brought our faculty of thinking to bear upon itself. And again, this is kind of the quintessential gesture of critical thinking. It's returning to something that we thought we had already understood, but giving it attempting to inquire more deeply into it, and allowing ourselves to be surprised. So I hope that what I've said, if nothing else, I hope that it can serve as a kind of inspiration or invitation to think further about some of these things. Suppose that what I've said is totally incorrect and totally wrong. That's good too, because by basically articulating and understanding why what I said is wrong, then you're also thinking critically. And so, no matter what, I hope that this lecture can be used for good in that sense. And by good, I mean that it can foster deeper understanding and foster a closer relationship to the truth of things. So that's probably a good place to stop, and I will end this recording now, but not before wishing everyone the best and just expressing my that I look forward to continuing this conversation wherever and however that may be. So farewell until next time.